Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Carlo for her briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom. Thank you, Rosemary, again for your briefing. And thank you again, Andre, for joining us this afternoon. Here in this Council, 1,000 days into Putin's full-scale invasion, the UK is keeping the spotlight on Ukraine, not just for the security of the Ukrainian people or just for Europe's security, but for something much more fundamental, which every UN member should care about: the right to be a sovereign, independent country, free to choose its future, protect its borders, and stand up to aggression. Everyone on this Council should be familiar from the climate crisis with the concept of tipping points, the critical moment after which changes are irreversible. These exist in geopolitics as they do in science. And unless Putin fails, I believe we face one over Ukraine. Unless Putin fails, we could plunge into a world where the principles enshrined in the UN Charter will have lost their meaning. Unless Putin fails, others will be inspired to wage imperialist wars of conquest. Unless Putin fails, our faith in international law may never return. And unless Putin fails, each of our borders will be less safe. If anyone doubted Putin's intent this weekend's massive missile attack on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure should serve as a reminder. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness. For years, the Kremlin has tried to bully Ukraine into submission. Russian missiles have struck hospitals and grain ships destined for Africa. Russian troops have raped and tortured Ukrainian prisoners, and Russian police have abducted Ukrainian children for indoctrination in Russia. Like a desperate gambler, Putin has got all in on this illegal war. Putin has lost so many soldiers, 1,000 days into a war he thought he would win in days. He's now turning to North Korea for reinforcements and to Iran for ballistic missiles. These actions must be met with a firm response, and that's why today I can announce fresh sanctions on Iran Air and Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, a direct response to Iran's ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. We are using the full force of our sanctions to constrain the Kremlin's illegal actions, from their shadow fleet of oil tankers to suppliers to their war machine, from shady kleptocrats to mercenaries destabilizing the continent of Africa. And we are stepping up our support to put Putin in a position of strength with a new loan backed by profits from sanctioned Russian assets, part of a new G7 package of $50 billion in assistance, and a commitment to £3 billion in military aid for as long as it takes. Let me be crystal clear. There is no equivalence, no comparison, no parallel between those reckless states who support Russia's illegal aggression and those who stand with Ukraine in defense of its sovereignty. Council, the Kremlin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness, but we must stand for the light of its freedom. Ukraine and its partners want peace in line with the UN Charter that brings us together today. But we know that Putin only responds to strength. To have a lasting peace, lasting security, we've got to stand as strong, as united, as patient, as determined as the Ukrainian people. And so I say that my message to Vladimir Putin is simple. We will never let up on countering Russian aggression at every turn. 1,000 days in, we stand for Ukraine. 1,000 days in, we still stand for international order. 1,000 days in, we still stand for the principles which the United Nations was founded upon. And 1,000 days in, we're ready to face down your aggression as the day you started this senseless war. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Également la
I
secrétaire
would also
générale
like to thank
adjointe
Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing.
Et je souhaite également la
And I
bienvenue
would
à
also
notre
like
collègue
to
ukrainien, le
welcome
ministre
our
des Affaires
Ukrainian colleague,
étrangères,
Foreign
Andriy
Affairs
Sybiha.
Minister Andriy Sybiha.
Alors que nous commémorons
As
le
we mark
millième
the
jour de la
1000th
guerre,
day of this war,
les mots nous manquent
words fail us
face aux
in the
souffrances de
face
votre
of the suffering in your
À
country.
travers
Through
vous,
you,
chers collègues,
My dear
j'adresse mes
colleague,
pensées
I
au
extend
peuple
my
ukrainien.
thoughts to the Ukrainian people.
Depuis 1000 jours,
Over
plus de
the
10
last
000
1,000
civils
days,
ont
more
été
than
tués, plus de
10,000
20 000
civilians
blessés,
have been
sans
killed,
oublier les
and
immenses
more than
pertes
20,000
parmi
wounded,
les soldats.
not to mention the immense losses among the soldiers.
Derrière ces chiffres
Behind
sans âme
these soulless figures
se cachent des
are
hommes,
men,
des femmes et des
women,
enfants.
and
Un
children.
drame.
What a tragedy.
Nous sommes profondément
We
préoccupés
are
par les
deeply
attaques
concerned
massives
about the
contre
massive
les
attacks
infrastructures
on energy
énergétiques des
infrastructure
derniers jours.
in recent days.
Un danger majeur
This is a grave
pour la
danger
population
to
civile
the
à l'approche de
civilian
l'hiver.
population as winter approaches.
La Suisse appelle encore
Switzerland
et encore
calls again
au
and
respect du
again
droit
for the
international,
respect of international
au
law,
respect du droit international
in
humanitaire.
particular respect for international humanitarian law.
Excellences, chers collègues,
Excellences, dear colleagues,
depuis 1000 jours,
for 1,000
tous
days
ces
now,
appels à la paix
all these calls for peace
sont restés vains.
have gone unanswered.
cette guerre est un facteur
This
de
war has
déstabilisation
become a
internationale
major
majeure.
source of international destabilization.
Déstabilisation sur le plan de la sécurité
Destabilization of
internationale
international
avec
security
la menace
with
nucléaire.
the nuclear threat.
Déstabilisation sur le plan de la sécurité
Destabilization
alimentaire
of food security
et de l'approvisionnement
and
énergétique.
energy supplies.
Déstabilisation du respect des
Destabilization
droits
of
fondamentaux.
respect for fundamental rights.
Et enfin,
And finally,
déstabilisation du multilatéralisme.
destabilization of multilateralism.
Le risque
The
d'extension de cette
risk of
guerre
this
est
war
alarmant.
expanding is
Je me
alarming.
réfère ici au
I'm
rapport
referring
faisant
here
état
to reports
de la présence
of the
militaire de la
military
République
presence
démocratique de
of the
Corée en
Democratic
Russie.
People's Republic of Korea in Russia.
Ces derniers développements sur
These
le champ de
latest
bataille mettent en
developments
lumière
on the
toute
battlefield
l'insoutenabilité
highlight
de cette
the
guerre.
unsustainability
pour nous
of
tous.
this war for us all.
Monsieur le
Mr.
Président, Mesdames et
President,
Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen,
il est temps que la Russie
it is
mette fin
time
à sa
for
guerre
Russia
contre
to
l'Ukraine,
end its war against
lancée en
Ukraine,
violation de la Charte
launched
des
in
Nations Unies.
violation of the UN Charter.
Après 1000 jours
After
de guerre,
1,000
les armes
days of
doivent
war,
se
the
taire.
guns must fall
Il est temps de trouver une
silent.
solution
It is
diplomatique.
time to find a diplomatic solution.
La souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de
Ukraine's
l'Ukraine à
sovereignty and
l'intérieur de ses
territorial
frontières
integrity within its
internationalement
internationally
reconnues
recognized
doivent
borders
être
must be respected.
Il y a 5 mois, nous étions
5
réunis en
months
Suisse,
ago, we
au
gathered in
Bürgenstock,
Switzerland in
pour parler
Buchenstock
pour la
to
première fois
talk
au
for the
plus haut
first
niveau
time at the highest
de paix
level
en Ukraine.
about peace in Ukraine.
Depuis, nous
Since
avons
then,
poursuivi
we
ces
have
efforts
continued these
sans
efforts
relâche
relentlessly,
et nous continuerons à
and
le
we
faire
will continue to do so
jusqu'à une solution
until such
diplomatique.
time as a diplomatic solution is found.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
faire la paix demande du courage.
making peace takes
Je l'ai
courage,
rappelé devant ce
as I
Conseil en
reminded
septembre
this
dernier.
Council last September.
Faire la paix
Making
demande aussi
peace
de l'énergie.
also requires energy.
L'énergie de
The
poursuivre
energy
la voie
to pursue
diplomatique
the
malgré la
diplomatic
fatigue,
path despite
malgré la
fatigue
frustration,
and despite
en
frustration,
particulier des hommes et des femmes
particularly for
sur
those
place,
men and women
aux
on the
portes d'un
ground
troisième hiver de
facing
guerre.
the prospect of a third winter of war.
Le courage d'impliquer
The
toutes les
courage
parties
to
dans ce
involve all
dialogue,
parties in
y
this
compris la
dialogue,
Russie.
including Russia.
L'énergie d'appeler
The
encore et
energy to
encore
call
à
again
l'application
and
de la Charte
again
des Nations
for the
Unies
application
ainsi qu'au
of the
respect des
UN
conventions de
Charter,
Genève
as well as respect for
et
the
l'énergie d'être à la
Geneva
hauteur de
Conventions
notre
and the
humanité.
energy to live up to our humanity.
La Suisse soutiendra toutes
Switzerland
les
will
initiatives et
support
efforts de
all
paix,
peace initiatives
de paix
and
fondés
efforts
sur les principes
that are
de la
based
Charte
on the
de l'ONU.
principles of the UN Charter.
Conscients des enseignements de notre histoire
Aware of the
commune,
lessons of our
nous sommes
shared
prêts à
history,
assumer nos
we are ready
responsabilités.
to assume our responsibilities
Pour le peuple
for the
ukrainien,
Ukrainian
certainement,
people, certainly,
mais aussi pour
but
notre
also
continent
for our
européen
European continent
et pour le monde
and
entier.
for the entire world.
Nous espérons tous
We
et
all
toutes
aspire,
à la paix et
each
à
and
la
every one of us,
stabilité.
to
Je vous
peace
en
and
remercie.
stability. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Miss Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Lammy, for bringing us together and chairing this important meeting. I thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo for sharing the Secretary General's statement and sobering briefing. I welcome the participation of Ukraine's foreign minister in this meeting today. 1,000 days ago, February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its brutal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. President Putin believed it would be a quick victory. Ukrainians would succumb, wave the white flag of defeat, and yet the Russian military failed to conquer Ukraine in its existence as an independent country or absorb it into Russia. When he couldn't break the Ukrainian military, Putin ramped up efforts to break the Ukrainian people, killing tens of thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children, uprooting millions of families from their homes, bombing out thousands of schools and hospitals, energy infrastructure and food storage, abducting thousands of Ukrainian children and relocating them into Russia. And yet, for 1,000 days, the people of Ukraine have not broken or bent. But while today is an important marker, there's nothing special about this somber occasion. Winter is approaching, and Russia's relentless attacks have devastated critical infrastructure, leaving millions of homes without light, heat, and water. Russia's seizure and militarization of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant puts all of Europe on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Every day, Ukrainian families live in fear of Russian war crimes. To date, troops have committed some 147,000 of them. And every night, Ukrainian families live in fear of Russian aerial strikes, which continue to pound the country. It is clear that Russia has no regard for Ukrainian life, but it's also clear that Russia has no regard for Russian life. You saw Russia just this morning veto a resolution on Sudan that would have facilitated humanitarian assistance. You heard them declare their support for the Palestinian people. But you, as I know this is just hypocrisy at its best and lies that they are concerned at the worst. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have died fighting this cruel and callous war. And 1,000 days since it began, the carnage has only accelerated. Russia is absorbing more than 1,200 casualties a day, more than at any other time during the war. And so, in its desperation, the Kremlin has turned to the DPRK, first for arms and now for manpower. At least 10,000 soldiers, sent first to eastern Russia and now to the far western Kursk oblasts bordering Ukraine, have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces. It is a move without modern precedent. Not in over 100 years has Russia welcomed foreign troops onto its soil. And it's one in blatant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1718, 1874, 2270, resolutions Russia agreed to only a few years ago. It's not just the DPRK Russia has looked to for help. Putin also acquired hundreds of UAVs from Iran, flagrantly violating Security Council Resolution 2231. All the while, Russia has disregarded its chemical weapons convention obligations and stated publicly it will supply captured weapons to non-state actors, including state sponsors of terrorism. Colleagues, these are the actions of a rogue state. And so rather than try and justify the unjustifiable, Russia simply lies. 1,001 days ago, Russia's representative told us to our face there would be no invasion. As the world watched live broadcasts of Russian forces and tanks crossing into Ukrainian territory and Russian missiles raining down on Kyiv, he continued to insist in this council there was nothing to see here. The lies continued. We were told that no North Koreans were deploying through Russia. Now North Koreans are fighting on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. All the while, this chamber has been flooded with slurs and baseless accusations against Ukraine's democratically elected leaders, along with specious arguments about how Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own path and partners somehow threaten Russia's so-called legitimate interests or legitimate security concerns. Of course, the UN Charter is very clear. No country, quote unquote, security concerns, legitimate or otherwise, give it the right to dictate another country's policies, let alone invade and annex another country's territory. All of this comes down to the fact that Putin has simply never accepted that Ukraine, a fellow UN member state, has the same rights to sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. Indeed, he has gone on the record multiple times saying, quote, Ukraine is not even a state, unquote. Perhaps it's why Putin so underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainian people, how bravely and effectively they have been able to defend their homeland, their democratically elected government, their culture and way of life for 1,000 days. As Ukrainians continue the fight against imperialist invasion and might makes right ideology, the United States stands with them. And let me be clear, when this war ends, a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine will be in control of its internationally recognized territory and continue on the path to joining Euro-Atlantic institutions like NATO. Until then, and at the direction of the President, the United States will continue to surge security assistance to Ukraine, including artillery, air defense, armored vehicles, and other needed capabilities and munitions. And we will announce additional security assistance for Ukraine in the days to come. Because ultimately, supporting Ukraine in Congress and beyond it cannot be and should not be a partisan issue. Standing up for democracy and human rights is above petty politics and outlasts any one leader or term. There's much talk about peace in Ukraine. Believe me, we would love nothing more than to see the people of Ukraine experience the safety and security they so deserve. But a peace that is not just is not peace. A peace that is not sustainable is not peace. And a peace that is not Ukraine-led is not a true peace. And so I call on all UN member states to support Ukraine's formula for a just and lasting peace, one that fully respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and holds Russia to account for its crimes and violations of the UN Charter. I again call on another permanent member of this council, China, to stop stoking war on the European continent, to end enabling Russia's war effort, to cease providing dual-use goods to Russia, and to quit parroting Russian talking points to justify this war, because there is no justification. Most of all, I call on Russia to end its aggression against Ukraine and now. in the support to countries like Iran and the DPRK, support that foments instability not only in Europe, but everywhere from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, in the assault on food security around the world, and especially in the Sahel, where millions of hungry people rely on the Black Sea Grain Initiative for sustenance, and in the needless suffering of Ukrainian and Russian people who have endured the unimaginable for 1,000 days. Let this misery, this madness, not continue, not one day more. Thank you, Mr. President.
Well, I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her excellent statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Fuji Isayuku, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary Lammy for organizing this meeting. I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. It has been 1,000 days since Russia began its aggression against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. To the people of Ukraine who have been defending their country for these 1,000 days, we express our deepest respect and unwavering solidarity. Last Saturday, Minister for Foreign Affairs Iwaya visited Ukraine and directly expressed to Minister Shibiha Japan's intention to cooperate with Ukraine to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, and stated that our steadfast commitment to stand with Ukraine remained unchanged. Mr. President, we are appalled by the massive and widespread missile barrage on Ukraine over the past week, which caused the casualties of innocent civilians. We will continue to condemn in the strongest terms Russia's illegal aggression, which has caused unimaginable human rights violations and abuses in the territory of Ukraine, in addition to the ongoing brutal attacks destroying critical civilian infrastructure. We repeat, Russia must immediately cease this aggression, withdraw from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, Russia continues its aggression against Ukraine with not only its own arsenal, but also weapons supplied by North Korea, violating the relevant Security Council resolutions which Russia had itself agreed upon. There is clear evidence, and subterfuge should never be tolerated in this chamber. The situation now enters another dimension as North Korea's soldiers have been dispatched to Russia, and they are now engaged in combat against Ukraine. Such involvement in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. North Korea's direct support for Russia in this regard has serious potential consequences for European and Indo-Pacific peace and security. Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. We condemn in the strongest term this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. We also reiterate our deep concern about military cooperation between Iran and Russia. The international community must refrain from supporting Russia's aggression directly or indirectly. Mr. President, the importance of diplomacy and dialogue for peace is indisputable. However, it should be crystal clear that Ukraine is not the one who is waging this war. Ukraine was forced to fight to defend itself. It is Russia that launched an unprovoked war of aggression. Once Russia stops its aggression and withdraws to the internationally recognized border, it will end immediately. What is needed now is not a call for peace that ignores Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, nor a demand for both sides to be escalated in an equal manner, which only rewards the aggressor. The question is whether to uphold or disregard the principles of the UN Charter. It cannot be clearer who violates the Charter. We must uphold the international order based on the rule of law and never tolerate violation of international law. Japan will continue its diplomatic efforts together with Ukraine and the international community to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Japan is committed to and will continue its long-term efforts to rebuild the lives of the Ukrainian people and the entire country. We have already pledged over $12 billion in support of Ukraine in the areas of humanitarian assistance, recovery, reconstruction, and finance, which are steadily being implemented. We will continue to provide support, including in the areas of energy supplies and landmine removal. To conclude, Mr. President, we emphasize that any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force is unacceptable anywhere in the world. Japan stands firmly with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fuji for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marko Stucin, Deputy Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Minister, for organizing this briefing. I would also like to thank Under Secretary General Di Carlo, delivering the statement on behalf of UN Secretary General. And I would also like to warmly welcome Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sibiha at this meeting. Tomorrow will mark 1,000 days of war in Ukraine, 1,000 days of death, destruction, and displacement, but also 1,000 days of inaction of this very council. I have just returned from Kiev, and while being humbled by Ukraine's perseverance and determination, I'm also deeply disturbed by the dire situation that the civilian population is facing as the country enters the third winter of this war of aggression. Just in terms of the toll on human lives, these 1,000 days have been catastrophic. Last week, I have also visited Bucha, one of many sites where mass graves were found in the first months of the war in Ukraine. In just one of them, 508 Ukrainians are buried, and the bloodshed continues. It is estimated that in the first half of this year, 3 times as many people died in Ukraine as there were born. The number of civilian casualties is at its highest in the last 2 years. This gloomy picture is only about to get worse as Ukrainians brace themselves for the winter. Just yesterday, Russia launched its largest aerial attack on Ukraine in months, hitting energy infrastructure across the country with more than 200 drones and missiles. Continuous deliberate attacks against energy infrastructure are not just military tactics. They are, first and foremost, attacks on civilians, taking away their lives, cutting off their heating, breaking their spirits. These attacks are a despicable violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, for 1,000 days we have been discussing the casualties of the war, and each time our deliberations were followed by silence and impunity. With each day of inaction by this Council, the integrity of international law, including the Charter, was diminished. A lot is at stake with this war. It is more important than ever that the Council members condemn aggression, that we demand respect for international humanitarian and human rights law, and that we make it clear to the perpetrators of war crimes that they will not get away with it and will be held accountable. A single day of war is one too many. There are no words to describe how tormenting 1,000 days of war are. We need a just and lasting peace as soon as possible, a peace that would not come at the expense of the fundamentals of international law, a peace that will be based on UN Charter and its key principles, safeguarding Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine, as the country under attack, must of course agree with any such peace plan. This is the only way to stop this war, and this war must stop. Until then, Slovenia will support Ukraine every step of the way. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Susin for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
أود بداية
At the outset,
أن أتقدم بالشكر
I would like to thank
للسيدة روزماري دي
Ms.
كارلو
Rosemary
على
DiCarlo
إحاطتها القيمة.
for her valuable briefing.
يأتي اجتماعنا
We are
هذا
holding today's
والأوضاع في
meeting as the
أوكرانيا
situation in
لا تزال
Ukraine
محل
continues to
قلق
be a
عميق.
cause for grave
أين
concern,
الحرب لا
where
تزال
the war
تحصد
continues to
الأرواح
claim
البشرية
the
البريئة
lives of innocent
وتدفع
civilians.
أعدادا كبيرة
It has
من
displaced a large
المدنيين على
number of
الفرار
civilians
بحثا
who are now in
عن
search
ملاذ آمن.
for a
حيث
safe
أدى هذا
refuge.
الصدام بين
This
الطرفين
clash
الأوكراني
between
والروسي إلى
Ukraine and
مأساة
Russia has
إنسانية.
led to a humanitarian tragedy.
كما أن هذه الحرب
This
التي طال
protracted
أمدها
war
خلفت ولا
has
تزال
caused and
خسائر
continues to
مادية
cause
فادحة
considerable
ودمارا
material
هائلا
damage
في
and
البنى
massive
التحتية.
destruction of
والذي
infrastructure.
يثير قلقنا
It
أيضا
is truly
هو
worrisome
أننا نكاد
because we have
نكون سلمنا
almost grown
بحتمية الأمر
accustomed to
في
this
ظل غياب
inevitable
أي
situation
تغير في
given
الأوضاع
the
على
absence
الميدان
of any change in the
وبالرغم من
situation
تعدد
on the ground,
المبادرات
despite
الفردية
the
منها
many
والدولية
individual and international
لتقريب
initiatives to
المواقف
bring
ووجهات
positions
النظر.
and points of view together.
منطق التصعيد والمواجهة
The parties
وكذا
concerned
منطق الاستقطاب
have chosen the
الذي
logic
لا
of
زال
escalation
يهيمن
and
على الأطراف
confrontation and
المعنية. لا
polarization,
يمكن أن
but this
يؤدي بنا
logic
إلى
will not
مخرج
lead
لهذا
to
الوضع
an end
المتأزم
to this tense
مثلما
situation,
سبقت وأن حذرت
and
الجزائر
Algeria
منه
has
في
already
عدة
warned of this
مناسبات.
on many
كما
occasions.
لا تزال بلادي تدعو
My
إلى
country
مواصلة الجهود
continues to call
لإعلاء
for
صوت
additional
الحوار
efforts to
ضد
give
لغة
precedence
الصدام
to
والحرب
dialogue
إيمانا منا
over
أن
confrontation and
الحل
war,
لا
because we
يمكن أن
believe
تتجلى
that a
مظاهره
solution
إلا من
can
خلال
only be
الحوار
achieved through
والطرق
a
السلمية
peaceful dialogue.
حيث أن هذا الحوار يكون
And this
مبنيا
dialogue
على
must
ثلاث
be based
نقاط
on three
أساسية.
essential
أولاً،
points. First,
ضرورة وقف
the need to put an
الأعمال
end to
العدائية
the
وحماية
hostilities
المدنيين.
and to protect
ثانياً،
civilians. Second,
الانصياع إلى مبادئ
compliance with the
ومقاصد ميثاق
principles and
الأمم
purposes
المتحدة
of the UN
وقواعد
Charter
القانون
and the rules
الدولي
of
التي
international law,
نتفق
and
كلنا
we all
على
agree on the
سموها
supremacy
وطابعها
and
العادل.
just character
ثالثاً،
of these rules.
معالجة الأسباب
Third,
الجذرية
addressing the
للنزاع
root causes of the
والأخذ بعين
conflict and
الاعتبار
taking into account
للانشغالات
the
الأمنية
security concerns
لكل الأطراف.
of all parties.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
أصبح من الضروري أن
it is
نعمل
necessary
سوياً لضمان حل
to work
دائم
together
لهذا
to
النزاع
guarantee a permanent
الذي
solution
لم
for this
تقتصر
conflict.
تداعياته على
And
المنطقة
the
فحسب
repercussions
بل
of this
توسعت
conflict are no
لتثقل
longer
كاهل
limited to the
العالم
region.
بأكمله
It has
خاصة
expanded and now
الدول
impacts
النامية.
the entire world,
ومن هذا المنطلق
particularly developing
تظل
countries.
الجزائر
Therefore,
مستعدة
Algeria
للمشاركة
remains ready
البناءة
to
في
participate in a
الجهود
constructive
لخلق
manner
أرضية
in
صلبة
efforts to create
لتسهيل
a solid
الحوار
ground
بين
to
الأطراف
facilitate dialogue among
وبهدف
parties
تعزيز
in
المشاورات
order to
على
strengthen
مختلف المستويات
consultations at all
ومع
levels
كافة
and
الأطراف
with all
ودعم
parties,
الجهود
and to
الرامية
support
إلى إرساء
efforts
سلام
to
عادل
strengthen a
ودائم.
permanent and just
وتبقى
peace.
الجزائر مستعدة
Algeria
لتقديم
remains
الدعم
ready to
اللازم
provide the necessary
لتغليب لغة
support to
السلام
give precedence to
واستتباب
the
الأمن
language
في
of
المنطقة.
peace
وشكرا.
and security in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. I welcome the participation of the ministers in this meeting, including His Excellency Mr. Andres Sibia, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, in this meeting. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the escalating security and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which has persisted for 1,000 days. In recent months, the conflict has escalated drastically, and the battlefield has expanded with intensified offensive operations by both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. With almost 2 years and 9 months of brutal conflict, Sierra Leone regrettably takes note of recent escalatory conducts of intensive large-scale drone attacks on Ukraine, and news reports that restrictions on the use of long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russian territory have been lifted. This follows recent intelligence and open-source reports that troops of the People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, are now engaged in combat in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. The reports, if confirmed, mark a dangerous escalation of the conflict and have the potential to dramatically increase in scope, with severe attendant risk and broader destabilizing impacts on regional and international peace and security. The inability of the Security Council to act further puts at risk its credibility and dependability to maintain and also address threats to international peace and security. Colleagues, given the regrettable, devastating impact of the conflict, let us remind ourselves of the worrying trend of civilian casualties for just the past 4 months. From the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine report of 9 August 2024, Sierra Leone notes an alarming increase in civilian casualties since March this year, with July being the deadliest month, with at least 219 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. The number of civilian casualties, particularly in Ukraine for August, were similarly alarming, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. According to OCHA and OHCHR reports, intensified hostilities and attacks in September 2024 led to another alarming civilian casualty numbers, with at least 208 killed and 1,220 injured. We take note of reports from Ukraine of multiple attacks in October, targeting civilians and vital infrastructure, such as residential areas, markets, railways, and grain storage facilities, using guided area bombs, strike drones, and missiles. Additionally, the attacks have reportedly continued to target and damage numerous civilian facilities across Ukraine, including electricity and gas facilities, despite the winter. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024 to 2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Sierra Leone calls on the international community to support this plan. We have reiterated in this Council that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services such as hospitals, schools, water and energy facilities are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone deplores attacks on civilians, vital civilian infrastructure, and protected objects. We call on all involved parties to take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. Mr. President, in addition to the mounting humanitarian challenges, OCHA has further indicated that humanitarian response efforts face growing challenges, including safety risks. 6 aid workers were killed or injured in July and August alone. It noted that in the first 9 months of 2024, the humanitarian community had provided at least one form of assistance to 7.2 million out of 8.5 million people targeted for support. This is despite the 2024 humanitarian appeal for Ukraine receiving less than half the requested $3.11 billion. Additional resources are critically needed to ensure much-needed assistance. The drastic escalation, alarming civilian casualty figures, and the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict on civilians, including the elderly, women and children in Ukraine, underscores the urgent need for the violence to end. All parties to the conflict must prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, as Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the seeming strategic approach to annexed territories, we take the opportunity to reiterate the UN Secretary General's instructive statement of 29 September 2022, in which he recalled that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from a threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We also recall Security Council Resolution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In a similar manner, we reaffirm the full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Let me close by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and energy infrastructure, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. Peace is made not between friends, but between parties in a state of disagreement. Therefore, peace should be actively pursued and not be left to chance. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive diplomatic efforts to achieve a just and lasting resolution of the conflict. In taking this important step, we further reiterate our call for the full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President,
我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长的通
I
报。
thank USG DiCarlo for the briefing.
乌克兰危机延宕至
The
今
Ukraine
已有
crisis
1000天，
has been ongoing for
当前
1,000
局势的
days.
发展
The current
走到
situation
了十字路口，
at a crossroads
正处在关键
and
时刻
a。critical juncture indeed.
一方面，地
On the
面
one
战
hand,
事仍在
the
持续，
fighting on the ground is
人道危机
continuing,
日
the
益严重，
humanitarian crisis is
外溢影
worsening,
响
and the
不断加
spillover
剧。
effects are intensifying.
冲突双方仍未
Both
放下
parties to
依
the
靠武
conflict
力
are
战
yet
胜
to
对
give
方的
up
执
their
念，
obsession with winning
仍在
by
相互
force
不断发
and
动
keep
大规模
launching
袭击，
large-scale attacks against
今
each
日正
other,
呈扩大
which
态
have
势。
been expanding in recent days.
另一方面，
On the other hand,
国际社会围绕乌克
the
兰危机
international
的讨论
community, in its
愈
consideration
发向
of the
谈
Ukraine
判聚
crisis,
焦，
has
向和
increasingly
平靠拢。
focused on settling through
从
negotiations
亚
and
洲、
pushing for
非
peace.
洲
From
到
Asia
欧
and
洲、
Africa to
美洲，
Europe and the Americas,
从南方、北
from
方
the south and the
到
north
东方、西
to the
方，
east and the west,
各国人民对和
the
平的期盼
aspiration for
越来
peace
越
from
强烈，
people around the globe
对和
is
平的
getting
呼声
stronger,
越来越响
and the
亮。
call for peace is
国际
getting
社会推
louder.
动实现和平的
The
条件
conditions for the
正在
international community
逐
to
步累
promote
积。
peace are gradually
今年
accumulating.
9月联大一般性辩
During
论
the
期
general
间，
debate of the
中
General
国、
Assembly
巴
last
西
September,
同阿尔及利
China
亚
and
等全球
Brazil,
南方
together
国
with
家举
Algeria
行
and
部
other
长级
global
会议，
South countries
发起
held a
成立乌克
ministerial
兰危
meeting
机
and
和平之友
initiated
小
the
组，
establishment of the Group of Friends
共
of
同
Peace
呼吁
on the
遵守
Ukraine crisis,
战场不外溢、
jointly calling
战
for
事不升
compliance
级、
with the three
各方
principles
不
of
拱火三
no
原则，
spillover from the battlefield,
共
no
同发出
escalation of the
早
fighting,
日
and no
停火止
provocation
战
by any party,
支持政
and
治解
jointly
决的
sending a
有
strong
力信号
message。for early ceasefire and for a political settlement.
历史反复证明，
History has
军
proven
事手段
time and
带不来
again
持久和
that
平。
military means will not bring
任何
lasting
冲突的
peace,
终点
and that
都
all
将是
conflicts
谈
will,
判桌
in the
前。
final analysis and at the
我们再次
negotiating
呼吁冲
table,
突当
we
事方
once again call
展
on the
现
parties to the
政治
conflict
意愿，
to demonstrate
早
political
日开
will,
启和谈，
launch peace talks
相
as
向
soon
而
as
行，
possible, meet
停火
each
止
other
战。
halfway, stop
再次
fighting
呼吁
and
国际
achieve
社会
ceasefire.
为此
We once
提
again
供
call on
支
the
持，
international community
创
to
造
provide
条件，
support and create
共
conditions
同
to
壮
this
大
end,
促进和平的努
and
力，
jointly scale up
形成
peace efforts
劝
to
和
form
促谈的
synergy
合力。
in promoting peace through negotiations.
主席，
President,
中方在乌克兰问题上的立场
China's
一以
position on
贯
the
之，
question of
坚
Ukraine
定
has
明
been
确。
consistent, firm,
我们
and
始终
clear.
站在和平
We
的一
have
边，
always been on
站
the
在
side
对话
of
一边。
peace and on the side of
自
dialogue.
危机爆发以来，
Since the
中方始
outbreak
终
of the
主张
crisis,
各
China has
国
always
主权、领
maintained
土完整
that the
都应
sovereignty
该
and
得到
territorial
尊重。
integrity of all countries should be
联合国宪
respected,
章的宗旨
that
和
the
原
purposes
则
and
都
principles
应该
of the
得到
UN
遵守，
Charter should be observed,
各国合理安
that the
全关切
reasonable
都应该
security
得到
concerns
重
of
视，
all countries should be
一
taken
切有利于
seriously,
和平解
and
决
that
危机的
all
努
efforts
力都
conducive
应
to the
该得
peaceful
到支
settlement
持。
of the crisis should be supported.
我们坚持对话谈
We have
判是
been
解决
loud
乌
and
克兰
clear
危机
in
的
that
唯一出
dialogue
路。
and negotiations are the
从俄
only
罗
path
斯、
towards
乌克
resolving the
兰等
Ukraine
有关各
crisis.
方
We have
均
maintained
保持接
communication
触、
and
交
exchanges
流，
with Russia,
积
Ukraine,
极
and
开展
other
穿梭
relevant
外交，
parties, actively
坚持
carried
不
out
懈
shuttle
劝和促谈，
diplomacy, and
推动
spared
政
no
治解决。
efforts in promoting peace through
当
negotiations
前形势
and
下，
pushing for a
中
political
方愿同
settlement.
有关各
In the
方
current
进
context,
一步
China
加
stands
强沟通，
ready to further strengthen
为推动
communication
和
with the
平曙
relevant
光
parties
早日
and
到来，
continue our unremitting
乌克兰
efforts
危机
and
早
constructive
日政
role
治解决，
in promoting the early
继续做
arrival
出
of
不
the
懈努
dawn of
力，
peace
发
and
挥
the early political
建设性
settlement
作用。
of the Ukraine crisis.
主席，
President,
刚才美国代表在
just
发
now
言
in
中
his
再次
statement,
对中方
in
污
her
蔑抹
statement,
黑，
the U.S.
向中方
representative
甩锅
once
推
again
责。
slandered and smeared China,
对此
shifting the
坚
blame
决
to
反对。
China, which we firmly
在此
oppose.
前的会议上，
At
我
previous
已经就此
meetings,
做出
I have responded
多次做出
firmly
回应，
on many
今天
occasions.
我就不重复。
I will not repeat them
这
today.
里我只想简要的指出，
I just want to briefly
乌克
point
兰危
out
机的
here
爆发
that the outbreak
与持续至
and
今，
continuation
与美
of the
国
war
有很
of
大
the
关系。
crisis in Ukraine has a lot to
未来
do
能否
with the
早日
United
停火止
States,
战，
whether there can be an
实
early
现政治解
ceasefire
决，
and
在
a
相当
political
程度
settlement
上
in the
也
future
取决于
will
美
also depend to a considerable extent on the attitude and actions of the United States. We hope that the U.S. behavior will stand the judgment of future generations and the test of history. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we wish to express our gratitude to Under-Secretary General Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for having delivered a very important statement by the Secretary General on the Ukraine issue. As the conflict rages on, calls for dialogue and diplomacy continue to be overshadowed by the relentless drums of war. This conflict, pitting two sister and neighboring nations, one against the other, has pushed the very fabric of our international architecture for peace and security to its limits. Now, in a phase of a protracted attrition and exhaustion, the conflict has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the people of Ukraine, deepening global divisions and shaken the very foundations on which the United Nations has been built. Moreover, the conflict has widened rifts between nations, eroded trust in international cooperation, and introduced grave risks to an already fragile global order, including the looming specter of nuclear threat. The humanitarian toll has reached catastrophic proportions in Ukraine, compounded by the disregard for international law and international humanitarian law. In addition to this devastating human toll, this war has served as severely disrupted global food and energy supplies, destabilized economies, and exposed critical vulnerabilities of an already unfair and unequal international governance system. Mr. President, the Ukraine-Russia crisis represents possibly the sternest test to international peace and security in the 21st century, in an interconnected world where no nation is immune to the suffering of others. In its aftermath, the landscape of global diplomacy has been profoundly tested. The resurgence of Cold War era mindset and dynamics, the erosion of trust among major powers, and the growing dependence on military alliances underscore the severity of our shared predicament. We regret to note that this is totally in contrast with the spirit and understandings that led to the end of Cold War that we witnessed in the 90s, about 30 years ago. More leadership and vision based on peace, more commitment to our shared concept of collective security, more dialogue, more respect for the sanctity of treaties, and less reliance on modern military doctrines could possibly have brought us to a different outcome, to a more peaceful and less dangerous world. It would have saved us from what an American scholar termed as the rise and fall of peace on earth. Mr. President, at the heart of Mozambique's position on this conflict lies our unwavering commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and to our own Constitution that holds as paramount the primacy of peace and the settlement of disputes by peaceful means. We advocate diplomacy and negotiations in conflict resolution conducted in good faith. They should not be construed as a sign of weakness, but rather as the foundational pillars of peace. Our humble experience as a nation that was built on the stone of a liberation struggle has taught us that it takes courage to wage war, but it takes even greater courage to make peace. Mr. President, it is deeply regrettable that despite numerous scheduled and unscheduled sessions, debates and briefings, the Council has remained paralyzed, unable to overcome divisions and act decisively in the interests of peace and security in Ukraine and in the world. Mozambique urges Security Council members and all parties involved to prioritize unity and collective action in search for peace, security, and stability. We join the wider international community in calling for an immediate end to this conflict on the basis of the principles and ideals that led to the founding of the United Nations and that bring us together in this chamber. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the UK for convening this important meeting. I also extend my gratitude to U.S. DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. I also welcome Ukraine Foreign Minister to this meeting. As we are nearing 1,000 days since the war on Ukraine started, it is simply deplorable that we continue to witness the loss of human lives, mass displacement, and destruction of critical infrastructure. The war is also shaking the international order. Indeed, the aggression of a permanent member of the Security Council against a neighboring sovereign state tramples the fundamental principles of the UN Charter: sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and refrain from the use of force. In addition, we see the global non-proliferation regime underpinned by the NPT precariously eroding. Since the war broke out, Russia, which led global efforts to establish the current non-proliferation regime, has heightened its nuclear rhetoric, suspended the New START Treaty, and de-ratified the CTBT. The ongoing war also represents a blatant violation of the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine agreed to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state in exchange for security assurances that have now been disregarded by a signatory state. The safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is also under threat. Furthermore, this unjustifiable war has been conducted in a cruel manner, involving wanton attacks on residential areas, schools, and hospitals, according to the recent UN reports. Mr. President, as the war continues on, its international repercussions have expanded both in magnitude and scope. Millions of refugees fled Ukraine into Europe. Global food, fuel, and fertilizer prices soared, particularly affecting the global south. Russia is even bringing in other countries to sustain its war machine. Among the various outside help for Russia, the most egregious form of abetting Russia's aggression on Ukraine has come from North Korea. The DPRK is estimated to have shipped about 20,000 containers to Russia since August of last year. This amount of giant shipping containers could carry as many as 9.4 million artillery shells. Yet no one knows how many more munitions will be on the way from the DPRK. Among the some 200 munitions factories in North Korea, those factories producing weapons shipped to Russia are now running at full capacity. Mr. President, now we clearly see yet another level of escalation. my government confirmed last Wednesday that North Korean troops dispatched to Russia have completed their deployment to the battlefield near the Kursk Oblast of Russia and are already engaged in combat operations. This is the first time since the Korean War North Korea is engaged in actual combat with massive troops, about 11,000 soldiers. Russia and the DPRK signed a new treaty, the so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, last June during President Putin's visit to Pyongyang. This follows a 29-year-long hiatus since Russia renounced its 1961 Mutual Military Assistance Treaty with North Korea. We see a possible nexus between the ratification of this treaty and the North Korean soldiers' engagement in combat operations today. Contrary to Russia's claim that their military cooperation should not worry anyone, as it is not directed against third countries, it does concern everybody, as it clearly infringes upon the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a state, and it directly affects many other countries in both Europe and Northeast Asia. This demonstrates how the security of Europe is linked to that of East Asia. Dear colleagues, what is even more troubling is that this movement may only be the beginning. You may be surprised to learn that the DPRK has a larger amount of military troops, well over 1 million, than Russia. North Korea is a militarized garrison state. Men are required to serve in the military for 10 years, and women for 7 years. Their mandatory military service is more like enslavement, as the OHCHR's recent thematic report on DPRK's forced labor pointed out. Pyongyang has not disclosed the dispatch of its troops to Russia, to its own people. The DPRK even relocated family members of dispatched soldiers to special sites to isolate and prevent them from spreading rumors. And these soldiers are even being issued fake IDs to disguise themselves as Russians. This is more akin to mercenaries than regular state-level military intervention. Mr. President, we don't know exactly what kind of payoff the DPRK is actually receiving from Russia yet, but we are sure that Kim Jong-un will exploit Moscow's desperate position and obtain whatever Russia is willing to offer: fuel and energy, or high-end military technology for its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Against all these possibilities, the Republic of Korea will respond to this unlawful military cooperation, which threatens our national security, and will take corresponding measures commensurate to ensuing developments alongside our partners. Mr. President, as this war has dragged on for 1,000 days now, I would like to offer some points of reflection. As Korea has also experienced a long, brutal war. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 saw even larger number of casualties during the armistice negotiations than during the preceding period war, as both sides fiercely fought to grab every inch of land before the armistice was signed. One of the major differences is that the battlefront of the Korean War during the armistice negotiations was more or less similar to the border of status quo antebellum. In contrast, in Ukraine, starting armistice negotiations now would mean dealing with a completely different battlefront from what it was at the outset of the war. In retrospect, with the crucial help of the free nations committed to UN Charter, the Republic of Korea was able to survive from the Korean War and now thrives with freedom and prosperity. This is why the Republic of Korea is helping Ukraine to survive from the invasion and then to revitalize, rebuild, and flourish. The Republic of Korea will continue to support all international efforts toward this goal and will continue its principled backing for Ukraine through its bilateral Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I begin by thanking you for convening this high-level briefing. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her insightful and sobering remarks. I welcome the participation of the Ukrainian Foreign Minister to our meeting today. In 2 days, we will mark the 1000th day anniversary since the Russian Federation decided to start a war of aggression against its sovereign neighbor, Ukraine, in violation of the UN Charter. As we approach this grim milestone, Malta remains firm in its belief that this Council must ensure that international law is upheld at all times. Regrettably, Russia's actions on the ground and in this Council constitute a direct affront to the principles and values that unite us. The unrelenting attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, in particular on energy infrastructure, which has direct impacts on Ukraine's social and economic development and on preparations for the upcoming winter months, have to stop. This Council must reiterate, in no uncertain terms, its call on all parties to uphold IHL and the principles of distinction and proportionality. Malta also continues to call for full, safe and unfettered access for all humanitarian workers currently operating on the ground in Ukraine. Just last Saturday, the Russian Federation launched a massive missile and drone attack on Ukraine, targeting multiple targets with a focus on energy infrastructure. People were killed and injured, and the country suffered significant damage to its energy plants, which led to blackouts and country-wide restrictions. This was one of the largest attacks on Ukraine in recent months, with a clear intention to deplete Ukraine's energy production capacity ahead of the winter months. This news is coupled with the increased intensity of missile and drone attacks, which have picked up during recent months. Ukrainian civilians continue to suffer the brunt of this unjustified and unprovoked war. President, we again express our deep concern with regards to the transfer of weapons and ammunition from DPRK and Iran to the Russian Federation. These transfers prolong Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine and continue to deteriorate the humanitarian situation in the country. Some of these transfers violate UN Security Council resolutions. In addition, the deployment of troops from the DPRK on the front lines in Ukraine represents a dangerous escalation. The presence of foreign troops on the front lines broadens this war. It also directly endangers European as well as global peace and security. We call on all states to stop supporting and enabling this illegal war of aggression. President, we stress the need for full accountability for all crimes committed by Russia and Ukraine, and reaffirm our support to the ongoing work of the ICC, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Register of Damage. We also further reiterate our support for the establishment of a special tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine. This Council cannot lose sight of this war and the importance of striving towards setting the conditions for negotiations to secure peace. We need to focus on achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter. We will support all efforts aimed at achieving such goals, providing that Ukraine is included at all steps during this process. We can never accept a world in which might is right, and therefore once again call upon the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw all its troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. Until that day comes, Ukraine has a right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo for the update and welcome the participation of His Excellency Andriy Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, in today's meeting. Mr. President, we meet today for yet another important meeting on the conflict in Ukraine. This time, on the eve of the 1000th day since the war began. Guyana is deeply concerned that for every additional day of this war, innocent lives continue to be lost. We are alarmed by the recent escalations and reiterate our call for a peaceful end to this war. We also demand that the parties uphold their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects from harm. The war has taken a heavy toll on the civilian population, especially in Ukraine. Millions have been displaced and forced to live as refugees in foreign lands. Those unable to flee live in constant fear of losing their lives, loved ones, and livelihoods. It is time to put an end to the suffering, to the death and destruction being inflicted upon innocent civilians for over 3 years. Mr. President, in its latest situation report, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights documented at least 183 civilian deaths and 903 injured in Ukraine in October. OHCHR has also consistently documented cases of arbitrary detention, torture, summary executions, sexual violence, transfers and deportations of children, and forced conscription of protected persons. This Council has a duty and a responsibility to respond to what is taking place. We must continue to demand that the parties comply with their legal obligations and find a peaceful end to this war. We have the entire UN mechanism at our disposal, with eminently qualified and skilled experts in all fields. We must put the system to work for peace. While we work to find a way to end the conflict, civilian lives must be protected. We must do more to agree on practical measures to minimize civilian harm. We appreciate the important contribution that UN agencies, international NGOs, and local NGOs have made in responding to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We hope these positive efforts will continue and call for independent monitors, including OHCHR, to have regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detained persons. We further call for continued international support for the victims of this war, inclusive of medical, psychological, and legal support, with particular attention to children and survivors of sexual violence. Guyana is encouraged by the momentum building in various capitals to advance peace initiatives and to ensure that children and prisoners of war are safely returned home. We remain hopeful that these initiatives will yield concrete results. Mr. President, it is without any doubt that the prolongation of this war poses increasingly grave risks and consequences for all concerned and for international peace and security. It has brought nothing but suffering and trauma for generations of Ukrainian and Russian citizens, not to mention its regional and international ramifications. Guyana reiterates its call for an immediate end to the hostilities. We also join the international community in reaffirming the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In this regard, we reiterate our call for the complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine. Finally, we urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and the continued engagement of the United Nations, led by the Secretary General. We will continue to support all peace efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I thank Madame Di Carlo for her briefing. Tomorrow will mark 1,000 days since Russia launched its war against Ukraine, which is illegal, unjustifiable and brutal. 1,000 days since Russia decided to attack a sovereign state which did not threaten it, to annex territory in contempt for the United Nations Charter and its principles. For 1,000 days now, Russia has been leading this war of aggression by piling up violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. It continues striking deliberately civilian population assets in Ukraine. With a human disaster that is getting worse, it continues to target energy infrastructure in the country, forcing the people of Ukraine to brave the cold of a third winter of war. It is imperiling global food security by striking port infrastructure and grain infrastructure, despite the efforts of France and its partners to enable the shipment of grain to Ukrainian grain to civilian populations in Gaza, for example. Russia is using sexual violence as a weapon of war, and it does not shy away from forced transfers and deportations of Ukrainian children. Those responsible for these crimes must be held to account. For 1,000 days, Russia has insisted on prosecuting its war of aggression, despite the growing cost of its war effort. For this, it is prepared to hollow out the foundations of the global non-proliferation architecture, equipping itself with weapons, munitions, and ballistic missiles from Iran and North Korea, flouting statements of this council. The presence of North Korean soldiers on the Ukrainian front is another flagrant violation of international law and a serious escalation of the conflict. Mr. President, for 1,000 days, the people of Ukraine have been defending themselves with courage that deserves admiration. Since the first day of the war, France has chosen to stand alongside Ukraine. We provide Ukraine with the military and humanitarian support that it needs in order to fight for its independence and its territorial integrity. It must be free to choose its alliances and its future. The right of Ukraine to its legitimate defense includes the possibility of striking military targets involved in operations aimed at its territory in accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. Ukraine must be in a position to defend itself and to commit, when it so decides, to negotiations with a view to achieving just and lasting peace. There cannot be any viable peace if we allow the aggressor to impose its will by force. The fighting in Ukraine is a concern to all of us. It is an attack on the principles of the United Nations Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is destabilizing the foundation of the international order of which we are the guarantors. It has been broadly condemned by the United Nations General Assembly. Allowing this war to achieve its goals is to risk to see everywhere the law of the jungle, the aggressive redrawing of borders, claims for spheres of influence in contempt for the sovereign equality of states. It is in no one's interest for such chaos to take hold. This is why we remain committed alongside Ukraine. We will continue to support the peace formula of President Zelensky, with regard to which France organized a conference on the nuclear safety and security in Paris on the 17th of October last. We will continue to work for a just and lasting peace in accordance with the resolutions that the General Assembly has adopted by a very broad majority. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, President. I would like to thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for the briefing that she gave on behalf of the Secretary General, Guterres, and I welcome the presence of high-level representatives here in the room. Millions of people continue to be victims of this conflict. There is no end to the forced abandonment of homes by thousands of families. Scars and more scars will take generations to heal. The environmental damage just cannot be measured. There is no end to the devastation of housing, schools and medical facilities, as well as critical infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector. The humanitarian situation is endangering millions of people who, as winter approaches, are in despair. Offensives and waves of drone and missile attacks run the risk of becoming endemic. There has been an intensification of geopolitical divisions affecting global stability and challenging the pillars that underpin international peace and security. Mr. President, speeches could be given in support of each of these assertions, and they would lead to an indisputable conclusion. The United Nations Charter, international law and international humanitarian law continue to be eroded in an alarming fashion with each development that we see in this unjustifiable war. As I stated in the meeting this morning on the war in the Middle East, every lost life is irreparable, and it's particularly shocking when we're talking about children. Enough is enough. The violence must cease immediately. President,
Las partes están obligadas a proteger a la población civil y respetar plenamente el derecho internacional humanitario. La ayuda humanitaria debe llegar sin obstáculos a quienes la necesitan, incluyendo los territorios ocupados. Los actores humanitarios deben poder operar con seguridad y sin restricciones. No podemos subestimar los riesgos que suponen una mayor escalada del conflicto y sus implicaciones para la seguridad internacional. Es crucial que las partes encuentren caminos hacia la desescalada y eviten cualquier acción que pueda agravar aún más la situación. El respeto a la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la independencia política de los Estados no es negociable. No existe disposición alguna en la Carta que admita o legitime el uso o la amenaza del uso de la fuerza como medio para resolver las disputas entre las naciones. A 1000 días de iniciar la agresión contra Ucrania y alrededor de un centenar de reuniones formales sobre la guerra en Ucrania, se conocen de manera meridiana las posiciones planteadas. Lo que corresponde ahora al Consejo es debatir sobre pasos concretos, responsables y valientes que contribuyan a detener el conflicto, así como valorar toda iniciativa de buena fe que favorezca este propósito compartido de la comunidad internacional. Recordemos que a pesar de las divisiones existentes, este órgano ya se mostró unido en la declaración de la presidencia de 6 de mayo de 2022 sobre Ucrania y reconoció que en virtud de la Carta todos los Estados miembros se han comprometido a resolver sus controversias internacionales por medios pacíficos. Señor Presidente, en línea con su vocación de paz, el Ecuador promueve la solución pacífica de los conflictos a través del diálogo y la diplomacia. Y por tanto, reafirmo su compromiso de seguir trabajando para avanzar hacia soluciones que permitan alcanzar la paz en estricto respeto a los principios establecidos en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, el derecho internacional y la soberanía, independencia e integridad territorial de Ucrania. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
есть
there is
определенный символизм в том,
certain
что
symbolism in
именно
the
наши
fact that it
британские
was
коллеги,
our British colleagues
председательствующие в
presiding
Совете
over the
Безопасности,
Security Council
в
this month,
текущем месяце продавили
who
проведение
forced
сегодняшнего
through
заседания,
the
пророчив
meeting
его
today,
к 1000
timing
дням
it
с момента
to
перехода
coincide to
украинского
1,000-day
кризиса в
mark
горячую фазу.
since the Ukrainian crisis
Мы
reached a hot
получили
phase.
еще раз
We
прекрасную
had
возможность
once again
убедиться,
an opportunity to
что
see
для вас и
that
ваших
for
коллег
you and your
это
colleagues,
не более чем броский
this is nothing more
медиаповод
than
для
just a good
шельмования
media
России,
opportunity to
навешивания
demonize
на
Russia,
нее
to place
тех
trite
затасканных ярлыков,
labels
которые предсказуемо
on it, the
изобиловали
kinds of labels that
выступления
your
западных членов Совета.
statements by
А в
Western
вашей
colleagues
стране,
predictably
Великобритании,
teamed with.
русофобия уже
And
давно,
in your
задолго до
country,
февраля
UK,
2022 года
Russophobia
была возведена в ранг государственной
has
политики.
long before 2022 made Russophobia a state policy. Please allow me to remind you that whilst preparing to the meeting today, you missed yet another media opportunity, and it has a much more importance in the context of the Ukrainian crisis than the date you chose. Last Friday, on the 15th of November, was exactly 950 days since the moment the former Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, visited Kiev. There, he, and we know that for a fact now, dissuaded the head of the Kiev regime from signing a Istanbul peace agreement with Russia, which had already been initialized. That would have stopped the hostilities. At the time, we were very close to it. And as a goodwill gesture, Russia even withdrew its troops from the north of Ukraine, in particular from areas near Kiev. In other words, 50 days after the start of the special military operation, where the losses among the Ukrainian armed forces were not yet that significant, the hostilities had every chance of ending if it hadn't been for the interference of the British Prime Minister, who convinced Zelensky that he should continue fighting, that he would have Western support and weaponry, and he will thus be able to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. The British Prime Minister and his accomplices were very much interested in such defeat. And so as to explain this kind of shift to the Ukrainian public opinion, the British special forces and mass media participated in staging a cruel provocation in Bucha. There, after the Russian forces withdrew, people's corpses were brought and arranged on the streets there, and the origin, the real reason for death, no one bothered to explain to us, despite the fact that we asked for it several times. In other words, it turns out that the UK pushed the Kiev regime towards its inevitable defeat, precipitating its choice for confrontation with Russia and continuing. And I think that Ukraine will long remember the fact that it's because of these actions on the part of your country Ukraine today is in a terrible economic state, that it lost most of its army and material, and also lost at least 4 of its regions, in addition to what was lost in 2014 when Crimea left Ukraine. Ukrainians have long stopped wanting to fight. What a volunteer looks like, the Ukrainian army has not known for 2 years now. The Kiev regime banned man's leaving from the country, and they're catching those people who are evading the draft on the streets using firearms. And they're throwing these people into a senseless meat grinder. The eastern front of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbass is collapsing. You know very well what the rate of the progress of our army is, and the Zelensky regime, whilst trying to keep Western support, undertook a senseless incursion into the Kursk Oblast, tried to capture and mine the Kursk NPP, and this resulted in the loss of tens of thousands of troops. This misadventure was a fatal error and accelerated the Ukrainian defeat, and they will not be spared from that defeat, no matter what kind of Western weaponry they're given. The initiators of the meeting today, as a matter of transparency, should have told us about the astronomical profits the UK received over the 3 years of military support to Ukraine. How, on the blood and tragedy of Ukrainians, your arms manufacturers became wealthy, and your defense ministry used up its old material, which had to be disposed of in any event. And also, it would have been good if you had told us about the corruption accompanying this, and the scale of that corruption, something we can only guess. The Ukrainian mass media themselves are saying that after Donald Trump's election victory, there was a panic again amongst Ukrainian elite, and not because the United States can revise the assistance to Ukraine, but because the new administration would want to take a look at all of the monies that had been sent to Ukraine and conduct a full audit of the assistance already provided. This scenario, as being said by the Ukrainian experts, is far more frightening for Zelensky because a considerable share of assistance is stolen or pocketed by the expired Ukrainian president and his entourage.
С учетом того, что объемы только военной
the
помощи
amount
киевской
of
хунте со
just
стороны
military
Великобритании с
assistance
февраля
by
2022
UK
года
since
составили
2022
$9,7
are in the amount of
миллиарда
$9.7
Свой
billion
вклад
US
в рост
dollars.
коррупции на
Given that,
Украине,
we
вне
can say
всякого
that
сомнения,
your
вносит и ваша
contribution
страна.
to the corruption in Ukraine was
Правда, вряд ли
certainly
мы
made by your
дождемся
country as
каких-либо
well. We'll
соответствующих
probably
расследований
not
со стороны
end up seeing
британских
any
властей,
kind of an
ведь в
investigation by
подобных
British
случаях
authorities,
следователям, как известно,
because
важно
in
не
such
выйти на
cases,
самих
what is
себя.
important in investigations is to make sure you don't end up
Господин
accusing yourself.
председатель, собственно говоря, для
Mr.
тех, кто знаком с
President, for
историей
those who
Соединенного Королевства,
know the
страны,
history of the UK, the
с
country,
историей Соединенного Королевства, ее
the history of
многолетнее
your country,
вмешательство на
its
Украине,
long-term interference in
кульминацией которого
Ukraine,
стали
which
упомянутые нами выше
culminated
действия,
in
не
the
стало
actions
каким-то
I just
откровением.
mentioned. This has not been a
Стравливанием соседей,
revelation.
внесением
Pitting
разлада
neighbors
между
against each
государствами и
other,
народами,
sowing
а потом
discord
поддержка
between
одних из
peoples
них
and
против
countries,
других,
and then
Великобритания с
supporting one
упоением
against
и
each other
знанием
is
дела
something the
занимается на
UK
протяжении
relished
столетий.
doing very well for
Все
centuries.
ваши бывшие колонии
All of
могут
your former
рассказать об этом
colonies can tell
красно.
about this in colorful detail.
К слову сказать, из
By the way,
нынешних 193
out of
членов
193
ООН
UN
только
member states,
22
only
государства могут
22
похвастаться
can
тем,
boast
что на их
that their
территории никогда не
territory has
вторгались
never
и с
been
ними
invaded
никогда
by
не
or fought
воевала
with
Великобритания.
the Great Britain.
Наша страна
And
здесь
my
не
country
является
is not an
исключением.
exception
Последним
here.
таким
Last
поражением
such
стала британская
invasion was a
интервенция
British
после революционных
intervention
событий
following the
17 года,
revolution of
1917 года,
1917,
когда Россию
when
пытались
there were
растащить на куски
attempts
различные
to
хищники,
tear
истребители.
Russia apart by various predators and vultures.
Но мы выстояли,
But we
прошли через
prevailed,
это, окрепли, и
we
теперь
went through
вынуждены
the
бороться
hardship,
против
grew
новой
stronger, and
опосредованной
now
интервенции
are
членов,
fighting another
воюющих
indirect
против России на
intervention
Украине
by
НАТО,
the members of
включая
NATO who
Великобританию.
are fighting Russia in Ukraine, and
Именно
this
так
includes
можно
UK.
воспринимать не только
This is how one
продолжающуюся
views
накачку
not
киевского режима
only the
оружием и его
continued pumping
подпитку
of the
разведданными,
Kiev regime
но и
with weapons and
присутствие британских
intelligence, but
инструкторов
also
и
the presence of
наемников,
British
сотни из которых
instructors and
уже
mercenaries,
ликвидированы,
hundreds
а
of them
также
already
попытки
eliminated,
локализации на
and the
Украине
attempts to
британскими
bring to
специалистами
Ukraine
производства
by British
беспилотников,
specialists
ракет
of
и без
UAV,
экипажных пилотов.
missile, and sea drone manufacturing.
Понимаем, что
We understand
Великобритании и в
that
21
the
веке
UK
оставить
in
Украину и
the
Россию в покое
21st
сложно.
century also
Ведь
finds it very difficult to leave
гены
Ukraine and Russia
тех
alone,
колонизаторов,
because the
которые
DNA
веками
of those
бесчинствовали в Азии,
colonizers
Африке
who
и Европе,
wreaked havoc
сказывается.
in Asia, Africa, in
Все мы знаем,
Europe
что
for
Британская
centuries
империя
are very
жестоко и
well in
цинично
you.
подавляла
We know that the
сопротивление своих
British
колоний в течение
Empire
250
brutally
лет,
put down the
прибегала
resistance
к
of its
насильственной ассимиляции и
colonies
расовой
in hundreds
дискриминации,
of years,
забывая о
used
простых человеческих
forced
ценностях и
assimilation,
правах
racial
народа,
discrimination,
находящихся под ее
forgetting
контролем.
about human values and
Именно
the
мирное
rights of
население
peoples.
колонизированных
The
стран расплачивалось своей жизнью и
peaceful
свободой
citizens
за
of
имперские
colonized
амбиции
countries
метрополии.
paid with their life and freedom
Достаточно
for
вспомнить
the
хотя бы
imperial
этнические чистки
ambitions.
в Ирландии, когда
Suffice
из
it to
более
recall the
1,5
ethnic
миллиона
cleansing
человек
in
населения
Ireland, where out
после
of
британского
1.5
завоевания
million
завоевания
people,
осталось лишь
only
800 тысяч.
850,000 were left
Во
after the
время
British
Второй Бурской
conquest.
войны на
During the
рубеже
Second World War, at the
19-20
turn of
веков,
the
именно
20th
англичане
century,
первыми
was the
изобрели
English who
концлагеря.
first invented
Изгоняли
concentration
в них
camps.
гражданское
They drove
население, чтобы оно
civilians
не
there
помогало
to make sure
большевикам.
they wouldn't help the Boer army.
Сколько человек тогда
How many
погибло,
people perished
неизвестно.
there?
Британцы
Nobody
не
knows,
считали
because
коренное население
the British
Африки за
didn't
людей и, в
didn't
принципе,
count the
не
indigenous people as
документировали
human and
потери
didn't
среди африканцев.
document their losses amongst the
Хотя
Africans.
известно, что в
We
Кении
do
после
know,
восстания
though,
Мао-Мао
that in
британцы
Kenya,
устроили
after the
массовые
Mau
репрессии,
Mau
убив
rebellion,
порядка 300
there
тысяч
were
представителей этой
mass
народности, еще 1,5
prosecutions.
миллиона человек
300,000
загнали в
people
лагеря и
died,
превратили в рабов.
1.5 million put into camps and made into
А в
slaves.
Индии,
And in
который
India,
за период
where
британского
during
владычества
the
был нанесен
period
огромный ущерб,
of
только
British
жертвами
colonialism
спровоцированного
was
Великобританией голода
done
стали от
enormous
15 до
damage.
29
A
миллионов человек.
famine was engineered, as a result of which 15 to 29 million
Последствия
people
действий
died.
бывших
The
колонизаторов
consequences of the
ощущаются в
actions of the
современном
former
мире до сих пор.
colonizers is something that
И
can be
хотя
felt in
колониальные
the world
империи
today.
формально ушли в
And even though
прошлое, старые
colonial
методы
empires are a thing
давления,
of the past,
манипуляции,
the
вмешательства в
old
суверенные
methods,
дела
pressure, manipulation,
продолжают использоваться в
interference,
новых формах.
continue being used in new ways.
Британия здесь не только не исключение,
Britain
скорее
is not
законодательный
an exception here. It's rather a trendsetter. And today, through their phantom pains for the empire over which the sun never used to set, longing for lost dominion, they're using together with their like-minded Franco-Saxon friends blackmail, sanctions, overthrows out of favor regimes through color revolutions, and one victim of such a revolution was Ukraine in 2014. And I'm saying all of this to show that there is no moral right to accuse or blame my country. It doesn't exist. When we set ourselves the goal of getting rid of the neo-nationalist and neo-Nazi hornet's nest in our borders, there's no such right. Until such time as the threat emanating from it, including the absorption of Ukraine by NATO, are not removed, until there's discrimination of Russian-speaking peoples because of their faith in history, until Ukraine continues whitewashing, glorifying identifying Hitler's accomplices until such time our special operation will continue. Its goals will be implemented in any event, diplomatically or militarily, regardless of whatever peace plans and schemes are being developed in the West in the interest of saving the entertainment actor Zelensky and his clique. And independently of the militarist agony of democratic administration, which has suffered a humiliating defeat in presidential election, lost the trust of most of its population, is now issuing, according to the mass media, suicidal permissions to Zelensky to use long-range weapons to strike inside Russia. Perhaps Joe Biden, for many reasons, has nothing left to lose, but we're astounded by the short-sightedness of the leadership of UK and France. They are eager to play into the hands of the exiting administration and are dragging not just their countries, but the entire Europe into large-scale escalation with drastic consequences. And that is what our former Western countries should think very hard about. Also, those who start thinking about freezing the front lines need to think about freezing the front lines along the Minsk agreements rejected by Ukraine and its Western mentors. Don't waste your time. We no longer have any confidence in that. We will only accept the kind of decision which will remove the root causes of the crisis and will not allow it to happen again. As for defeating Russia on the battlefield, I suggest that you abandon this idea. Europe has tried this several times, and the outcome of each such attempt is well known to you. I thank you.
I note the statement from the representative of the Russian Federation. In my national capacity, I don't propose to dignify that statement with any kind of response, other than to note that it was a series of lies, misinformation, and deflection. I will allow Ukraine to speak for itself in terms of its own actions in this conflict. I now resume my function as President, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States who's asked for the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for taking the floor, but I just need to respond very briefly to some comments that were made by the representative of the People's Republic of China. Let me just say very briefly that the U.S. will not ignore the support being given by China to Russia's military-industrial base. And we will continue, as I've said many times, to call out and condemn this support by China and others abetting Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, which, as we all know and shouldn't need to be reminded, is in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Countries cannot claim to support peace and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity while taking actions that undercut both. And my last point, just to respond to my Chinese colleagues' comments that the U.S. will be judged badly by history for in some way instigating this war against Ukraine. On the contrary, it will be China through its no limits partnership with Russia as it carries out an illegal war of aggression against the Ukrainian people. That will be judged by history, and undoubtedly very badly. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, President. I hope before speaking, my U.S. colleague will first get to understand the current situation. What is the current situation? That is, the call for peace is louder than the instigation for war. The call for unity and cooperation is louder than the instigation for division or confrontation. I hope my U.S. colleague will understand that deliberately expanding crisis and prolonging the war and using the opportunity to suppress other countries and promote one's geopolitical interests. Such an attempt will not succeed. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Andriy Sybiha, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thanks a lot, Mr. President. As well as my British colleague, I will not dignify the lie of Russian envoy, total lie. So, Mr. President, I would like to thank the UK presidency for convening this meeting and for its strong leadership. We do really appreciate. As we mark 1,000 days of Russia's full-scale invasion, let's not forget that Russian aggression against Ukraine has already lasted over 10 years. I departed for this meeting during one of the largest air attacks in months. Russia launched over 200 drones and missiles at peaceful Ukrainian cities. I spent a sleepless night with my family, with my kids, just like thousands of Ukrainian families. Russia struck critical civilian infrastructure once again: ordinary residential buildings, energy system, transmission substations of our nuclear power plants. This is a direct threat to nuclear safety and security. In some cities like Odessa and Sumy, many people are without power and heating. 10 people were killed in Odessa and 12 people, including 2 children in Sumy. Many more were injured. These strikes are Russia's response to everyone who recently called and visited Putin, asking him for peace. Putin wants war, not peace, and we must increase the price of the war for him. 1,000 days is a very big number. On one hand, it proves Ukrainian bravery in the face of brutal Russian aggression, as well as the support of our partners, for which we are grateful. On the other hand, this number proves the failure of the international community, including this esteemed Council, to stop wars of aggression and atrocities. We must be honest, international mechanisms have failed. They are not working. We need to create new tools. We need to be principled and united to restore respect for the UN Charter. Mr. President, 1,000 days of resistance to a total war is an enormous price to pay for a nation that simply wants to be free and live a normal life. Today, I will speak about the price of the war. The price we, Ukrainians, are paying, the price people around the world are paying, and the price the aggressor must pay. But most importantly, I will speak about the price of appeasement. In other words, what the world will have to pay if it chooses appeasement instead of just peace. The price the world will have to pay if world leaders choose weakness instead of strength. The goal of achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace is urgent. Whatever the price of achieving is now, the price of further failures will be much, much higher. By launching its invasion, Russia harmed many more countries and people than only Ukraine. This invasion has worsened many global crises. Russia weaponizes food, energy, and other resources, affecting millions of people. Russia's naval blockade of Ukrainian ports led to food shortages and record high food prices. About 400 million people around the world rely on Ukrainian grain. Many of them were put at the risk of hunger. Russia is also weaponizing energy and endangers people not only in Ukraine but also in other countries. This war was one of the primary factors that slowed global economic growth and increased inflation. Furthermore, such a blatant violation of international law caused a global security crisis. If Russian aggression succeeds, other aggressors will be tempted to attack their neighbors and commit atrocities. Since the beginning of its aggression in 2014, Russia has violated about 400 international treaties. That's the reality. Defense spending world is rising and taking resources away from education, healthcare, tackling climate change and other important global issues. Mr. President, no one in the world pays a higher price for Russian aggression than the people of Ukraine. This is why they, and only they, must be the ones to define the terms of peace. Imagine what it's like to lose in 1 second your beautiful young wife
and 3 children, aged 10 and 2 years, and just 2 months, because your home was struck by a Russian drone. This is what happened a few days ago to 34-year-old Maxim Kulik from Kryvyi Rih. This is the price of the war. This year, Russia intensified executions of Ukrainian prisoners of war. We are currently investigating 49 criminal cases involving the killing of 124 of them. According to UN, 95% of our prisoners of war faced torture in Russian captivity, brutal tortures. Some of the most horrible crimes of this war are crimes against Ukrainian children. Russia stole every Ukrainian child's normal childhood. At least 659 children were killed by Russia since 2022, numbers that continue to rise. This is the price of the war. And let me be clear, for us in Ukraine, there is no difference where a child suffers. In Ukraine, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America, or other regions, no child in the world deserves to suffer from the war. Widespread crimes and human rights violations are being committed right now against millions of Ukrainians who remain in the occupied territories. The forcible deportation of at least 20,000 Ukrainian children might be the largest state-run children kidnapping operation in history. Thousands of them remain in Russia. They are subjected to indoctrination, forced Russian citizenship, adoption of foster placement with Russian families, and even name changes. These actions by Russia violate the Genocide Convention, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Fourth Geneva Convention. In this regard, I refer to the Montreal Pledge made by participants in the recent Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of the Peace Formula. They pledged assistance for the return of children, and I urge everyone to join these noble efforts. Thousands of Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian hostages are still held in Russian captivity without proper access of international monitors and medics. We remember all of our people, and we will not rest until we free all of them and return them home. The list of Russian atrocities committed in Ukraine proves that the current international tools are not working. We need new mechanisms to ensure accountability for the crime of aggression and all subsequent crimes. If this requires setting a precedent, let's set a precedent. If this requires amending the Rome Statute, let's amend it. We must act to restore international peace and security. Colleagues, the price of inaction or appeasement far exceeds the price of strong steps. If we allow Russia to continue aggression and go unpunished, this will create unacceptable risk for global security, nuclear safety, environment, migration, and other areas. Russia is now aligning itself with such rogue states as Iran and DPRK. This emerging axis is in an active phase and of undermining the global order. The involvement of regular Northern Korean troops marks a new level of escalation and global proliferation of war. This is a real part of a North Korean ballistic missile KN-23 that struck Ukraine. Such deadly missiles fall on our people constantly. They can carry around 500 kilograms of explosives. The most recent hit was Brovary near Kyiv on November 13th. We know precisely what North Korea wants to get from Russia in response: technology for missile, nuclear, and other military programs. This will have an impact far beyond the borders of two states, including in the Indo-Pacific. The same applies to the deepening of Russia's defense cooperation with Iran. By the way, we have proof that Russia started using thermobaric warheads on Iranian Shahed drones to cause maximum destruction. And the question is, what does Tehran want from Moscow in return? Again, very specific things that can further worsen the security situation in the Middle East. This war is much larger than Ukraine, and its price for the world can get much higher if we don't stop Russia now. In total, between February 2023 and October 2024, the Ukrainian Defense Forces recorded more than 4,600 cases of use by Russia of ammunition containing hazardous chemicals. Today's report of OPCW is a timely reminder of all the red lines crossed by Moscow. It confirms the evidence provided by Ukraine, in particular a grenade marked RGVO and the corresponding soil samples. We have proven that Russia uses prohibited chemical substances on the battlefield. For Russia, this is also a war for natural resources, a very colonial approach. They try to capture Ukraine's rich deposits of manganese, uranium, titanium, and other resources. And we must stop the aggressor from proceeding further if we want to avoid these critical resources falling into the hands of Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Russia currently loses around 1,500 soldiers killed and wounded in action per day. Russia loses in 10 days in Ukraine a comparable amount of soldiers to the Soviet losses in Afghanistan in 10 years of war. These are the bloodiest occupied square meters ever. This also shows how low is the price of human life in Russia. Mr. President, the world cannot afford peace in any cost in Ukraine, because in the end the price will be too high. It might lead to an even larger possible global war. We witnessed this in 2014. Then the prevailing argument among appeasers was, Russia only wants Crimea, it will not go further. But it did, and the weak response did not deter Russia, it encouraged further violations. Russia started the war in Donbass. Ukraine signed the Minsk agreement and held almost 200 rounds of negotiations with Russia. There were 20 ceasefire agreements. 8 years of peace process ended when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. By the way, next month will mark the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum. Today, this document stands as a reminder to the whole world, never trust Russia. Their word has no value. So why should anyone believe that Putin will act differently now or on a new argument? Not before we raise the price for his aggression. As a core principle of our approach, we must recognize that there can be no compromises on territorial integrity and sovereignty, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else. The fastest way to end this war is to increase the support of Ukraine. It needs to defend itself and to compel Russia's withdrawal. Equipping Ukraine with the necessary means and removing artificial limitations on weapon use will speed up just and lasting peace. Tightening sanctions will deprive Russia of funds for the war. Next year, Moscow plans to feed $146 billion into its war machine. At the same time, Russia's shadow fleet can bring at least $120 billion in oil revenues. We must cut these bloody revenues. Supporting Ukraine, President Zelensky's victory plan and the peace formula is the only realistic path to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine and the world. And one more important point. There is no justification for putting Ukraine and Russia on the same footing as two sides of the war. This is not a conflict between two parties. This is a war of aggression. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine defends itself. False moral equivalence must stop. Mr. President, let's realize the price we have already paid for this war, a war that no one wanted except Russia. Let's realize the price we will have to pay for appeasement. Let's take real action for real peace, peace through strength. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sibiha for his statements. Colleagues, I wish to remind speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing light on the collar of the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her valuable briefing. I also welcome participation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Shiba, in this meeting. As the war is about to enter its fourth year, the highly attritional nature of the conflict remains unsustainable for all parties involved. The cost of the war is mounting, having already inflicted profound suffering on millions in Ukraine and beyond. In addition to the worsening humanitarian crisis, the current situation continues to threaten nuclear security. Since the beginning of the war, Turkey has maintained a principled policy on three main fronts. First, commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Second, supporting any initiative that aims at achieving peace. And third, mitigating the fallout of the war. The risk of an uncontrolled escalation, posing a threat not only to Europe, but to global stability, is still a possibility. This escalatory trend might reach to an unmanageable level with severe regional and global repercussions. Despite the risks involved, there is still no strategic vision on how to end this war. Both sides are still investing in a military victory. However, the world cannot afford a prolonged war in Ukraine. That's why we need to focus our efforts on finding a workable, pragmatic and realistic plan to achieve peace, to avoid a global catastrophe. We remain convinced that this conflict can only end through negotiations. In line with the UN Charter, any peaceful resolution of conflicts must advocate for a just peace rooted in international law. We must jointly continue our calls for restraint on use of force and leave room for diplomacy. Ultimately, a just peace can only be achieved through direct dialogue and mutual understanding. A result-oriented approach should be developed jointly before it's too late. Negotiations on various tangible topics, such as food and energy security, maritime safety in the Black Sea, and exchanging of prisoners of war, could be the basis for peace talks. The time has come to identify common ground to discuss how to reach a just and lasting negotiated settlement between the sides. To establish the much-needed peace in Ukraine, Turkey is prepared to play a facilitating role again when the sides are ready. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tomorrow, we will mark a solemn milestone, 1,000 days since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, it bears remembering that Russia's war of aggression actually commenced in February 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea. For more than a decade, a permanent member of this very council has perpetrated atrocities, bombarded civilians, and committed egregious human rights abuses in blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. Let me state it loud and clear. Russia continues to violate the basic principles of the UN Charter system, such as territorial integrity and national sovereignty, through its naked attempt at a land grab. Mr. President, Czechia is gravely alarmed by the recent escalation of the DPRK's direct involvement in this war of aggression. Not only is Pyongyang supplying ammunition and ballistic missiles to Russia, but it is now also deploying its troops in Russia to be used against Ukraine. Russia is brazenly violating the very Security Council resolutions for which it voted, undermining both the global non-proliferation regime and the authority of the UN Security Council. Moreover, the DPRK's direct involvement in Russia's war of aggression poses a dire threat to the Indo-Pacific security. We have repeatedly urged fellow UN member states, including China, to cease enabling Russia's aggression against Ukraine by providing Russia with political and military support. We are deeply concerned by credible reports that Chinese companies have been supplying goods with clear military applications, including one-way attack drones and engines for military UAVs. China's ongoing delivery of tools that Russia needs to continue its aggression against Ukraine and its people represents an intolerable perpetuation of this conflict. This in turn directly threatens European as well as international peace and security. Mr. President, as we mark 1,000 days of Ukraine's unwavering resistance against Russia's full-scale invasion, Czechia reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the Russian war of aggression. We remain fully committed to providing political, financial, humanitarian, and military support to Ukraine and its people as they exercise their legitimate right to defend their homeland. To conclude, I remain convinced that our common goal now must be to intensify efforts to ensure that Ukraine emerges victorious from this horrific war and secures a just and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening today's Security Council briefing. I also thank USG De Carlo for her valuable insights. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. Today we must recall the horror of peaceful towns and villages of Ukraine that 1,000 days ago, overnight, were turned into rubble and their residents became victims of the Russia's war crimes. Only in the town of Bucha, which was under Russia's troops' control in March 2022, suffered over 100 targeted killings. This weekend alone, Russia launched more than 120 missiles and 90 drones targeting Ukraine civilian infrastructure. In Odessa, 10 people were killed, over 40 injured. Russia continues to violate the UN Charter, disregarding multiple GA resolutions, including on principles of the UN Charter underlying a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine that was adopted in February 2023 with a majority of 141 votes. Russia ignores the order of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend all military operations in Ukraine. Also on 17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova over allegations of involvement in the war crimes of child abduction during the invasion of Ukraine. Over 19,000 Ukrainian children have been taken from the Ukraine to Russia. Mr. President, Ukrainian people continue to fall victims of Russia's attacks. The latest OCHR report has documented that conflict-related violence since 2022 killed over 11,000 civilians and injured over 24,000, and the actual numbers are much higher. We are witnessing a disturbing surge in aerial attacks by Russia targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Over the past 2 months, the use of long-range drone attacks by Russia's forces has escalated dramatically. In this regard, I would like to express our appreciation for the work done by the UN in Ukraine. OCHA, UNHCR, and UNDP, and other humanitarian agencies working tirelessly and under threat to alleviate sufferings of the Ukrainian people facing Russia's war of aggression. In 2024, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania has been included in the Ukraine's regional refugee response plan coordinated by the UNHCR. It complements the government-led responses to provide protection and support for refugees from Ukraine. Over 170,000 refugees are being hosted in the Baltic states this year. Mr. President, Russia has stepped up its war of aggression by turning to alliance with the DPRK, which violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions, namely Resolution 1718, Resolution 1874, and Resolution 2270, all which Russia itself supported and committed to uphold. The DPRK's involvement by providing ballistic missiles and now troops and heavy weapons in Russia's war against Ukraine poses an increasing threat to regional stability in Europe and Asia with severe global repercussions. This escalation from Russia and the DPRK demands firm international response. We call on the Technical Secretariat of the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to monitor the situation in Ukraine closely, as Russia is reportedly using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Mr. President, we fully support Ukraine's victory plan. First and foremost, this includes Ukraine's joining NATO. Ukraine's membership in NATO is the key for long-term security and stability in Europe, and our own security is incomplete without it. We strongly reject attempts to pressure Ukraine to negotiate on unfavorable terms at the expense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity, as this approach has nothing to do with just and sustainable peace. Ukraine alone shall define the terms of peace in accordance with the principles of international law and Ukraine's peace formula, prioritizing its sovereignty and territorial integrity and holding Russia fully accountable. Only just peace can be truly sustainable. We demand Russia to unconditionally, completely, and immediately withdraw all its military forces and equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank USG Di Carlo for the briefing, and also to express my delegation's appreciation to the United Kingdom for allowing us to convey to the members of the Security Council our deepest and legitimate concerns as a neighboring country and the Russian aggression against Ukraine that is happening for 1,000 days tomorrow, already today in Europe. And I would say this is 1,000 days too many. This war of aggression unequivocally violates the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity and the UN Charter. It constitutes an intentional breach of international law and an attempt to change the peace and security architecture. Ukraine's response to this war of aggression is the legitimate mode of action of self-defense in line with the UN Charter, and Romania has been supporting Ukraine all throughout. It is our shared political and moral responsibility to support Ukraine in its fight for independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. We place our trust in international law and in the UN principles, and we believe each sovereign nation is free to decide its foreign and domestic policies. We condemn strongly deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian critical infrastructure, including recent attacks over the past few days. We heard today from USG Di Carlo, as we heard in the past 1,000 days from other briefers, about the high price Ukrainian civilians are paying, and we just heard from Foreign Minister Sibiha on this exact high price the civilians in Ukraine are paying. And we are all too familiar with the severe impact of this war on food security, not only for Ukraine, but for many countries around the world. We are also confronted with a considerable high risk for maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, as USG Di Carlo also mentioned, with Russian missiles endangering commercial ships. Mr. President, my last point today regards the future. The UN Charter needs to be at the core of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Accountability is at the forefront. No country should assist a war of aggression, irrespective of when or where it happens. The only option is an immediate and complete withdrawal of Russia's troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. And this message has been valid on day one of the aggression, as it is now 1,000 days after. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honour of speaking on behalf of the European Union and its member states, candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Georgia, and Liechtenstein, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino align themselves. I want to thank the UK for organising this meeting, and of course, USG Di Carlo for her very important briefing. Colleagues, tomorrow marks a somber milestone, 1,000 days since Russia has provoked an unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a war of aggression that continues to shake the world, 1,000 days of senseless human suffering, 1,000 days of an unprecedented violation of the UN Charter, 1,000 days of inspiring courage and resilience by the Ukrainian people. In light of these grim circumstances, I would like to emphasize three key points. First, Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and its attempts to acquire territory by force concern every single EU member state. We must, all of us, condemn such actions today, because otherwise we will end up condoning similar blatant attacks on any and all of us tomorrow. Protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all UN member states, regardless of their size and power, is a collective duty. Second, Russia must abide by the will of the global community, as expressed in several resolutions of the UN General Assembly, and immediately and unconditionally cease its war of aggression, including its deliberate attack against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and energy sector. Attacks on civilian infrastructure have surged, leading to the highest civilian casualty rates since the start of the war. Yesterday morning, we witnessed yet another such massive Russian attack. Russia has a plan to to weaponize energy and to pressure the Ukrainian people ahead of a freezing winter into submission, they hope. Shame on them. And Russia disregards the civilian lives in the territories it currently occupies. Extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, systematic use of torture, sexual violence, crimes against humanity. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable. And beyond Ukraine, Russia, of course, continues to weaponize food. It has continued to intensify its efforts to disrupt the Black Sea corridor with attacks on civilian port infrastructure in and around Odessa. Here again, we have to condemn them, all of us. Third, we urgently need a comprehensive, just and lasting peace anchored in the UN Charter. To this end, Russia, the aggressor, must withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. No initiative about Ukraine can be taken without Ukraine. And any serious proposal for peace must be based on the UN Charter and international law. We urge third countries to cease all assistance to Russia's war of aggressions, not just direct military support, but also provision of dual-use goods and other sensitive items. And we condemn the deepening military cooperation and arms transfers between the DPRK and Russia. They also flagrantly violate multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. Friends, participation of DPRK troops in Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine would represent a unilateral hostile act by the DPRK at the reckless invitation of Russia, with grave consequences for European and global peace and security. And in closing, Mr. President, for the past 1,000 days, a brave Ukraine has been exercising its inherent right to self-defense in response to Russia's illegal, unprovoked, brutal aggression. We must continue to defend Ukraine's right to protect its territory and its people in line with the UN Charter. We must continue to protect the integrity of the UN Charter itself. And we must keep doing so for as long as it takes. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. I extend my appreciation to Under-Secretary General De Carlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. Let me also welcome the participation of Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha of Ukraine in today's meeting. Today's Council agenda covers two extremely serious situations. Following this morning's briefing on the devastation in Gaza and Lebanon, particularly for civilians, we have now turned to the devastating consequences of Russia's war. This week marks a grim milestone, 1,000 days of Russia's harrowing war of aggression against Ukraine, 1,000 days of devastation and suffering for Ukraine's people, 1,000 days of Russia's massive attacks on civilian infrastructure in clear violation of UN's Charter. Russia bears sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis, depriving millions of civilians of access to housing, water, heating, and electricity. Russia's attacks have severely damaged or destroyed more than half of Ukraine's energy production capacity. Russia's full-scale war of aggression has had devastating consequences, not only in Ukraine, but across the globe. In recent weeks, Russia has intensified its attacks against civilians, critical infrastructure, grain storage facilities, ports, and civilian vessels in the Black Sea. These attacks have serious repercussions for the world's most vulnerable populations, those who rely on grain from Ukraine. We cannot stand idly by in the face of such actions. We will not accept a world where states can invade and subjugate their neighbors with impunity. Let us not forget that in the Ukrainian-occupied territories, Russia is conducting a brutal campaign of cultural indoctrination and assimilation of Ukrainian children. The United Nations was created precisely to prevent such acts of aggression, to protect the principles of peace, sovereignty, and the right of all nations, large or small, to exist in security and dignity. Mr. President, while Russia continues its onslaught, others are working doggedly to find a way out of this nightmare. The Ukrainian 10-point peace formula, the joint communiqué on a peace framework, and the recent ministerial conference on the human dimension of the peace formula, hosted by Canada with Norway and Ukraine, make vital contributions to finding a way to peace. Any peace initiatives must be in line with the rules and principles of the UN Charter, including respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and internationally recognized borders. Any peace plan must also be crafted in collaboration with Ukraine. Russia continues to reject peace and presses forward with its brutal assault on Ukraine. Russia has engaged the largest ground forces to be seen in Europe since World War II. In addition to the massive Ukrainian civilian and military casualties, Russia's aggression over the last 1,000 days has resulted in hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers killed or wounded, another testament to the depravity of this war. These massive losses, mainly of young men in their prime, have driven Russia to seek external support to sustain this illegal war. The DPRK and Russia have engaged in illegal weapons transfers, ammunition, artillery and ballistic missiles, fueling and prolonging Russia's aggression and violating numerous Security Council resolutions. All states have an obligation not to aid or assist in an aggression. Russia's decision to train and deploy troops from the DPRK on the battlefield marks a dangerous escalation that further threatens regional and international security. This Council has a duty to condemn this escalation unequivocally. The Russian Federation is in continuous violation of international law, as well as undermining the status and authority of the Security Council itself. Russia's desperation will not deter our resolve. We will continue to stand up for the UN Charter and for Ukraine's right to defend its people and sovereignty in line with international law. Mr. President, we demand that Russia immediately withdraw its troops from Ukraine, reverse its illegal and dangerous course, and end this destructive war. Mr. President, while 1,000 days is a long time, there is one thing that has not changed. The Nordics will continue to stand with Ukraine, as we have done for 1,000 days, and we will remain by your side in your struggle. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iceland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, we are approaching the tragic milestone, 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. Moscow not only continues to flout the most basic rules of international conduct, but is also seeking support from the third states and involving them in its aggression. Therefore, this war not only threatens regional stability and global security, but also exacerbates the world's most pressing political and economic problems, including the disruption of food supply chains. Russia's relentless onslaught against Ukraine escalated this weekend with one of the largest aerial attacks in the recent months. Targeting critical energy infrastructure across the country, Russia caused widespread power outages, significant property damage, and tragically the loss of innocent lives. Such attacks not only elicit immense physical and psychological harm, but also aim to undermine Ukraine's resilience and the harsh winter approaches. The looming energy crisis in Ukraine is further aggravated by the nuclear threat arising from the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Poland unequivocally condemns these heinous atrocities and demands an immediate end to Russia's brutal war. We also remind Russia that attacks directed against civilians, including stealing children and destroying civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks on densely populated areas, are clear violations of international humanitarian law and constitutes war crimes. Those responsible must be held accountable and justice must be served. Russian propaganda inverts reality, twisting also here in this chamber the definitions of the victim and aggressor. This blatant distortion directly contradicts UN General Assembly resolutions, which recognize this war as Russian aggression and condemned it. In this context, we reiterate that through its defensive operations to diminish Russia's capacity to wage its illegal war, Ukraine is exercising its inherent right to self-defense in full compliance with international law as enshrined in the Article 51 of this UN Charter. We will back the victim of this aggression for as long as it takes. Poland has earmarked almost 5% of its GDP for this assistance, with 1% of GDP allocated to support Ukraine and 4% of the GDP dedicated to the cost of assisting Ukrainian refugees. Mr. President, everyone yearns for a new chance at peace. However, any peace agreement must be forged through consent. No one should be compelled to accept a peace that does not align with the interests or aspirations of the victim. That being said, let me be very clear. There is no shortcut to peace. A just and lasting resolution must be agreed upon with Ukraine, with the participation of all affected countries and support of the international community.